My name is Timothy Perkins. I'm with the Greater Des Moines Partnership Inclusion Council, specifically for this event with the Education and Action Committee. I want to thank my other committee members, Elaine Acosta, Erica Acosta, Joe Gonzalez, Mary Hunter, and Michelle Kraft for being on the committee and helping with this, especially Joe Gonzalez and Michelle Kraft. And especially thank our guests, Miss Terry Hernandez and Miss Catherine Huggins for agreeing to speak for us to cover the topic of women in the workforce and how the pandemic has changed the workforce. Although we had struggles before, now we have more or different ones. So it's a very timely topic, a very important topic, especially with Women's History Month. A couple of housekeeping notes, Make sure you keep your mics on mute. You're free to put questions in the chat, or when the speakers ask if you have any questions, to unmute and ask your question. I'd be happy to answer all those. So real quick, Terry Hernandez was born and raised in Iowa and spent most of her life in Des Moines. She's a graduate of Iowa State University, and she's led the Chrysalis Foundation since 1997, when she became the first and founding executive director. Hernandez and her staff of 4 lead the public charities work to improve the lives of girls and women in the Greater Des Moines area through grant making, community engagement, and education, and philanthropy. She and her husband, RJ, are parents to 3 rescue pit bulls. Ms. Catherine Huggins is a confident, strategic counselor to top executives, rising stars, and newbies in the public, private, and non-profit sector. She served as Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds' chief advisor from 2017-2019. She's also a chief advisor to Kim Reynolds from 2013 to 2015 when she was the lieutenant governor. With her passion for making a difference and strong Northwest work ethic, Catherine hit the ground running early in her career. At age 23, she was appointed chief speechwriter and deputy press secretary by the nation's longest serving governor and former U.S. ambassador to China, Terry E. Branstad. Prior to that position, Catherine served as a communication manager in the Iowa Office for Programming and Planning, Public Policy Department. Now, as executive VP of Huggins Consulting Group, she spearheads the firm's strategic planning, government relations, issue management, scenario planning, crisis communication, and executive communication efforts. Catherine also is just as comfortable writing news releases, opinion editorials, trade articles, or executing media relations. Clients have called her the consummate professional. And thank you both very much for being here. We have a lot of content to cover, and I don't want to keep you any longer than I need to, so I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tim. And we also want to express our deep appreciation to so many people that helped make this happen today. Dr. Marvin DeGier and his team. We also want to thank Mike, who's running the technology today. Without him, this wouldn't be possible. Joe, Michelle, Tim, thank you for inviting us. And to each of you who have taken the time to be with us today, we know your time is valuable and we want to work really hard to meet and exceed your expectations. So again, thank you for taking the time to participate. With that said, Carrie and I felt that it was very important to have some common definitions of what we're talking about today. And so I also want to share with a quote that's really important that ties back into this. And it says, "Never underestimate how extraordinarily difficult it is to understand a situation from another person's point of view." And that's why we wanted to have these common definitions today. Specifically, we wanted to talk about how we define diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we want to thank the United Way of Central Iowa for providing these definitions, and they rolled it out through their 21-day equity challenge in 2020. So diversity. Diversity includes all the ways which people differ and encompasses all the different characteristics that make one individual or group different from one another. It's all inclusive and it recognizes everyone and every group as part of a diversity that should be valued. And if you really want to shorten it, this is what diversity means. Diversity is about the quantitative representation of people with different backgrounds. When you look at the next one, equity. Equity is the intentional inclusion of everyone in society. Equity is achieved when systemic, institutional, and historical barriers based on race, gender, sexual orientation, and other identities are dismantled and no longer determine socioeconomic, education, or health outcomes. Equity is about the distribution of power and resources and ultimate outcomes on the quality of work or quality of life measures. Inclusion. Inclusion is a value that we place on, a value and a practice of ensuring people feel they belong and that their input is valued by a whole group, organization, society, or system, particularly regarding decisions that affect their lives. Inclusion is about the experience of belonging and meaningful participation in a decision that affects one's life and work. So now that we have these common definitions, I'd love to turn it over to Terry, who's going to talk a little bit about equity. And she's extremely insightful and well-respected. So Terry, please.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you again to the partnership for inviting us and for all of you who are watching. We decided when Catherine and I met to give this presentation somewhat in 3 chapters. So what we'd like to take a look at today are 3 separate timeframes. What we're calling the old paradigm, or the world as it was pre-COVID. Many of us have gone back long before, well before, myself, very far before pre-COVID. But the old paradigm includes maybe the last several decades and how women's roles have changed over time. We also will be focused on the great adaptation, which is what we're calling, in a positive frame, what the COVID pandemic has caused us to do, the changes that we have been forced to make, many of us throughout the last couple of years, and some of us continue to be working in that realm. And then beyond normal, we'll take you to today and beyond. So we'll not only talk about the changes as they have taken place and where we are today, but moving forward, what things you can expect and the types of things that you can take away to apply to your own life, your own career, your own workplace, your own team, and understanding the difference that diversity, equity, inclusion can make in your life. So I will also share with you that we're going to focus on 4 key areas where we measure participation. So we're going to be talking about various populations, groups. I myself will be talking about gender and the female population, but we'll focus, both of us, on areas including leadership, power, influence, and culture, because those are realms in which we can measure progress, we can see the steps that people have taken to improve their lives, and we can see how society operates in those 4 areas. So let's take first the old paradigm of leadership. Economists tell us that women's participation in the workforce has been stagnant for decades, preceding the year 2000, even before the pandemic. Male leadership positions were kind of implanted in our minds, those of us that are old enough to remember the Leave It to Beaver type family where the father came home from work, the mother was at home. And that's the type of lifestyle that many of us grew up with or are familiar with. It's been reinforced by media and through depictions of women only as homemakers. Just over a decade ago, very few women led corporate offices. And so I'm sharing with you the statistics from about 10 years ago, in 2010, Iowa women's employment by industry. It's a little bit small for you to see on this diagram, but if you look at the next page, you'll notice that roughly half of the population of women in Iowa are in service occupations. We're in service occupations, and that was primarily education, the retail trade, hospitality, service industries, etc. So you didn't see women in the corporate office. The model of the man in leadership position has prevailed over decades. And that is the model of leadership that many of us, when we started our careers in the 60s and 70s, felt we needed to emulate. On the next slide, we'll see Catalyst, a women's leadership research company, always assesses women's positions in the work world and the world beyond. And 10 years ago, reported that less than 5% of CEO positions across the globe were held by women. So now let's go to the paradigm of power. And you can see from Rosie the Riveter, which was the wonderful adoption of women in the workforce after World War II, it attempted to depict the strength of a workforce of women because men were involved in the battlefields. This icon was to encourage women to join the workforce in pursuit of the war effort. Women were about a third of the workforce then. We earned about 65% of what men earned, even in the same jobs that women were taking while men were in battle. Power can be measured by how much one is paid, as well as how many women represent women's concerns at tables of decision-making, such as government, business, and the public sector. So the next slide, we'll see, some of us have been around long enough to remember this. This is John F. Kennedy, President John F. Kennedy in 1963, signing the Equal Pay Act. And that was 1963, nearly 60 years ago. That was a law, as you remember, requiring that no wage disparities could be based on sex. Well, I can tell you that in 1963, women earned about 59 cents compared to men working full-time. And since then, we've not made a tremendous amount of progress. I think over time, the best we've done is around 80 cents to a man's dollar. But women of color, of course, have always done far worse. We'll look at the pay gap across the country, and you can see this was in 2018, that income disparity prevailed across the country. Those that had little or no pay disparity were only those states on the West Coast and Illinois. Most of us really struggled with getting women's salaries up to being equitable to men's. The pay gap closed by less than a nickel during the 21st century. And the pay gap contributes to a lot of issues that we're facing today, including poverty, Social Security for women who typically outage men, pensions, life insurance, et cetera. That is all based on earnings. So here's an example on the next slide of what that disparity means over a woman's career. If a woman is a high school graduate and is only making what women's wages are and has that wage gap, a woman could lose at least $700,000 all the way up to a professional school graduate whose salary cap by the end of her career might be $2 million or more short of what a man would have earned in the same position. So that continues to be a struggle for all of us. In representation, I'd like to show you a study that was done by Iowa Women Lead Change, Nexus, the Carrie Chapman Cat Center, and others that showed women's representation in the state of Iowa, and this was in 2014. In each of these areas, the orange sections, the pie charts, are women's participation. So you can see it's a little tough to read, but elected officials, all the way up to various boards, municipal and state boards, the best women have done is roughly 50% of representation in these public leadership positions. And remember, these are the people who are making decisions for every single person, including women, children, and family across the state. The next slide will show you a figure from 2019, and this demonstrates the lack of women's representation in politics. This is from Rutgers, and it blames the problem on sex discrimination, negative stereotypes of women in leadership, hostile environments in boardrooms and C-suites, and implicit bias. And if any of you are familiar with what's going on in Washington today, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. These are challenges that women continue to face and continue to prevail in preventing women from achieving political leadership at a level that would be equally representative of men. So the next subject we'll look at in the old paradigm is influence. And what we talk about when we say influence is having an effect on something. It's that having the authority, having the ability, or having some supremacy in an area, being able to influence something. For women to gain influence, it's taken decades. And so what you can see here are the women working in protests way back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. We continue to struggle to have equal representation in various roles, to have equal employment opportunities. Women at the time were considered an extension of their husband, primarily before suffrage. Women were considered to have the same belief pattern and the same ideas and goals as their husbands. They weren't considered as anything individual. Their voices were completely discounted. So likewise, in the old paradigm, we know that there were many efforts to recruit women and try to bring women into the fold. But you can see from this cartoon that even though efforts were shared to bring equity into the workforce, for women to squeeze into those roles oftentimes never occurred. There were barriers, there were stereotypes. The media, of course, again, always has exacerbated the disparities, and women were always considered less than or not as good as. It's been hard for women for a number of reasons, including the fact, for the most part, that we're in an environment run and controlled by men. So the great adaptation is what Catherine and I call the years of the pandemic, 2020 and 2021. You'll remember statistics as high as 11.5 million women lost jobs, and that was in the first 3 months of the pandemic in 2020, which was just appalling. But there were a number of reasons for that. That's compared to 9 million men. Women lost jobs for a number of reasons, including the need to care for their children. Schools were closed, businesses were closed, businesses went remote. And continuing to lose women in these jobs and women working remotely has caused women to choose to leave the workforce equally because of the stress of balancing so much at home and what the expectations of the workplace are. I can tell you that in February of 2022, at least over 50% of the new jobs went to women. So most recently last month. So things are looking a little bit up as far as reemployment. So that's one bright spot that we're looking at. But also if you look at in leadership positions, when women are back into the workforce, even though women comprise 50% of all jobs, many are occupying jobs that were more familiar to men. They're taking jobs in manufacturing, mining, logging, and transportation, oftentimes because the pay is better, and oftentimes because those positions are open. So women continue to strive to get back into the workforce and take those non-traditional jobs, but still remain only 8% of CEOs in the Fortune 500 companies. So we're still striving to move up that ladder into the CEO office. Also power in the great adaptation. And you'll remember that we talk about the power of women being seen in earnings and being seen in representation. And for women, the burden of unpaid care has been a tremendous responsibility. Women spend about 5 hours a day providing caregiving, even when they're working. And this contrasts with men who reportedly spend about 1 hour and 20 minutes, according to the Pew Research Center. Women also, when they're returning to work, have faced a motherhood penalty, a term that is coined for women who take time off to have a baby and trying to come back to work are perceived as having a lack of commitment, and the pay may be reduced because of that break in their work life. The opposite is true for dads. So you may hear corporate leaders or employers say, well, I'm going to pay that man more because he has to support a family. He probably needs money. The Center for American Progress noted that women earning a median wage before the pandemic would lose more than $250,000 of income if she's 2 years out of the workforce. So that gap is a significant one. We also saw that countries with female leaders throughout the pandemic fared much better than countries run by men. And that can be seen in countries like New Zealand, Finland, Norway, Taiwan, that recovered from the pandemic or were taking steps to make the right decisions for populations in order to keep people at work, to keep businesses open, and to keep healthcare available. Many women also during the Great Adaptation began to look at career changes. So we found that over 60% of women are planning to change jobs. In fact, when surveys have taken place over the last couple of years, many women have said, you know, maybe this is a time for me to become my own boss. I may decide that I'm not enjoying the workforce and not really willing to go back into that situation. Maybe I should just become my own boss and create my own business. So as we look at ideas around the Great Adaptation, equality was a problem in representation before COVID. And with women out of the workforce, leadership continues to be stalled. So the pandemic has accelerated those trends that women have been fighting over time to move ahead and to occupy those high-level positions. And with all of the barriers that we face by stepping out of the workforce, leadership pipelines have closed, have shrunk, high attrition of talented women in the workforce because of the need to take care of family. All of those things have contributed to a lack of women having the opportunity for growth and progress in their own career. Particularly in culture for working moms, who are most likely to report having a great disruption in their life throughout the pandemic, facing that burden of unpaid care and household responsibilities. Work from home has been difficult for women in general. There's a higher overall stress. We've heard talk about the pressing mental health challenges for women who are trying to balance everything, including expectations of work when they're working from home and trying to educate their children, take care of their families. Oftentimes, there are those of us that are in a sandwich position that are not only taking care of children, but we're taking care of aging parents. So we try to be super women and really struggle, probably more to the expense of our own health. So when we look ahead beyond the norm, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at today and going forward. Catherine and I wanted to provide some suggestions to you. It harkens to the phrase that Benjamin Franklin had stated, something like, those who fail to prepare to fail. And I think now is the perfect time for all of us to begin to retool ourselves, to be thinking about the types of things we can do to improve the situation for gender equity moving forward. From top management to mid-level teams and to individuals, we need to look at setting new standards. So for business leaders and CEOs, there are a number of ideas I can give you to retain and attract working women. Of course, you hear that workplace flexibility is really one of the keys, and you've probably heard from staff members that love working remotely. I personally do, because I can leave and walk the dog or go get some lunch and come back. This is very beneficial, not only for women, but for families, because you can take care of the needs of your family while continuing to pay attention to the goals and objectives of your work. You can also ask groups of women what they need. Do they want to strive to achieve that corner office? Are they looking for personally some flexibility? Are they looking for development opportunities? What sort of things are they looking for in their own careers? And then if there are development potential, and a woman wants to grow in her career, then look at making those growth opportunities available to everyone, whether they're in-house or remote or hybrid. Look at different ways to make those training opportunities possible for those that are working remotely. In 2014, Gallup study found that gender diverse retail business units had a 14% higher average revenue, and gender diverse hospitality staff showed 19% higher revenue for quarterly profit than those that did not have gender diversity. So when you are thinking about rehiring and you're looking at potential candidates, gender diversity can add to your business bottom line as well. We look at policies that you have in the workplace. More than 1/3 of women in the workplace have also been victims of sexual harassment, other pay policies, etc. So why is it important to look at your entire organization as far as building gender equity? Well, here are the reasons. Not only do you have a wider pool of talent, because it doesn't make sense to leave half of the pool of talent out of the mix when you're considering filling positions, but you also have reflection of consumers that are decision makers and purchasers. If I'm going to a business that's led only by men, I don't see myself getting engaged with that business because I don't see them having an understanding of what my lifestyle and what my needs might be. It also is a signal of a healthier company. At Chrysalis, we say it's your corporate responsibility. You show that by your support of women and girls. And then there are statistics, for those of you that are statistic geeks, that women in leadership positions for an organization increase revenue, improve client service, build greater shareholder value, they reduce turnover, I go on and on the benefits of having women in leadership positions. You can see from this chart as well that every 10% increase in working women is associated with a 5% increase in wages for all workers as the production and the productivity of the labor force increases. So you can see again those benefits that are showing equalizing the playing field really adds to the benefit of your long-term business. So look at women as potential. You can add quite a bit to your GDP. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco said in 2022 that if it was equitable, men and women of gender equity across the workforce were true, it would have added about $500 billion to the United States gross domestic product just in 2019. So consider what that looks like in dollars translated going forward. And then finally, when you look at teams, what sort of things can you do within your work team? And your overall thinking, if you are a supervisor or a manager, look for champions and advocates, both women and men, that can promote a culture that supports women, that exposes gender bias, that supports inclusion and an atmosphere where women thrive. Look at the language that you use within your work pod or within your department. Often unconscious bias appears in language and communication. So think about terms, a lot of us use terms like drama queen, gentleman's agreement, etc. Think about retooling those terms. Maybe omit courtesy titles such as Mr., Mrs., Ms., and use a person's given name. Gender inclusive nouns and pronouns, a spouse instead of a husband or a wife. Second or third person in some of the business correspondence you're using, you, they, applicants must fill out, etc., instead of he or she, etc. And emojis as well. You've seen emojis now coming in various skin tones. Look at the types of emojis you might be using and think about male, female, various skin tones, etc., to build some equity in your communication line. And finally, for individuals, there's simple changes you can make in your personal thinking as an employee, as a person in this society. Not only do you need to be aware of your own biases, but be comfortable speaking up if a woman is interrupted or if a woman is inappropriately harassed. Lift others up, especially women. Be an advisor, a coach, a mentor. take time to understand someone's circumstances or viewpoints and support those that are working differently. Oftentimes when someone comes back from a leave, there is this unseen barrier by those employees that might have felt a little bit of resentment or jealousy that they were able to take time off. Well, you don't know the whole story. So think about using some empathy, understanding people's situations, realizing that their life is not comprised of the 8 to 5, and pay more attention to offering that grace to other employees. The last thing I'll say is that gender equity is just one type of equity that needs attention, but it's about creating workplaces that reduce bias, support diversity, and work for everyone.
I'm gonna have a copy of these, right?
I'm going to share with you
Oh.
information now about diversity and inclusion in the workforce.
Thank you, Terry. You can tell Terry and I both feel very strongly. We're passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And earlier today, you heard about my credentials, but you didn't hear about why I personally care about these topics as an individual, as a business owner, and as an educator. My family and my extended family members closely mirror the changing dynamics and fabric of America. I have a family that's defined by the following: special needs, religion, race, gender, education, and socioeconomic issues like poverty and prison. I know firsthand what it's like to see our niece who has special needs, or my cousins who have alternative viewpoints excluded from society due to these different choices in race or sexual choices or gender. My family has ministers and deacons, doctors and felons, veterans and peacekeepers. And that is why my family strives for equity, diversity, and inclusion in every day in the neighborhoods, cities, and states across this nation. And that is why I wanted to be here today. I wanted to share a few thoughts with you. I wanted to help you move forward to make the difference in your organization, your business, your community, and within yourself. So here we go. Welcome to part 2 of the story behind the old paradigm, the great adaptation, and beyond normal. So first up is the old paradigm, specifically the old paradigm pre-COVID. During the next few minutes, we're going to discuss where we've been as it comes to business, education, and socioeconomic and government. And just as Terry did, I'm going to be focusing on the following key areas. I'm going to focus on leadership, power, influence, and culture. So here's leadership. In the old paradigm, leadership came and it was predominantly white and male. And in 2019, that remained the case, despite some slight improvements. For instance, within the Fortune 500 board of directors, it was overwhelmingly white. And you can see this in this slide. It was at 83.9%, and that was in 2019. If there's any good news to share, the percentage of ethnic minorities made incremental gains. The Standard & Poor's company boards became more diverse from 2015 to 2019, moving from 16.9% to just more than 21%. The Russell 3000 company boards increased representation from 2015 to 2019, going from 8.8% to 13.3%. That's a little bit of progress, but it's still not enough. So let's look at the old paradigm when it comes to power. Specifically, I want to talk about education. I want to talk a little bit about retention rates in education, because in 2015, US education was still separate and unequal. Consider the retention rates. In 9th grade, 12% of Black students were held back versus 4% of white students. At that time, fewer Blacks graduated from high school than whites, at 16% versus 8%. And I want you to think back to an earlier slide by Terry when she was talking about the inequity of pay and the effect that education has on earnings. And when it comes to power, in 2015, there were distinct socioeconomic issues tied to education. Nearly 25% of Black parents reported at that time that their children lived in unsafe neighborhoods, compared with 7% of white parents. Consider that 25% versus 7%. Black Americans were suspended and expelled at 3 times the rate of white students, and Black students were arrested more and referred to law enforcement more. When it comes to influence, the old paradigm was brutal. A picture's worth 1,000 words. Just take a look at that. And in 2015, the Pew Research Center reported that the 114th Congress was the most diverse in history. 1 in 5 members of the House and Senate were racial or ethnic minority. And it's scary that that number was viewed as good news. So let's talk about the culture of the old paradigm, specifically organizations and businesses. Patriarchal is defined as greater male than female when it comes to power and status. Attributes seen as feminine pertaining to women were undervalued, and attributes regarding masculine pertaining to men are privileged. So why are we talking about patriarchal when it comes to culture? Because there's a structured set of inequities that are inflexible and resistance to change. And that's what we saw. Based on what we just covered, it's really important to know that the great adaptation, which Terry talked about earlier, embraces flexibility and change due to COVID. During this part of our discussion, we're going to talk a little bit about the implications for business, education, socio-economic, and also government. So let's talk about leadership. What did leadership look like during the Great Adaptation? Leadership drove the change mindset related to business and organizational success during COVID. We saw COVID as a never-ending crisis, and it forced new ways of thinking and operating, such as working from home and flex hours. It encouraged creativity in the workplace. It was more like, how are we going to survive this? And we moved from, no, we can't, which you saw in the paradigm, to yes, yes, we can. And that changed the mindset that shifts to power. In 2021, we saw President Joe Biden sign an executive order that was to strengthen the federal workforce by promoting diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. We also saw some progress made on the political front. And according to the Pew Research Center, racial and ethnic diversity increased with the 117th Congress. About a quarter of the voting members, 23%, of US House Representatives and Senate are racial or ethnic minorities. So let's see how influence changed during the Great Adaptation. And specifically, I want to focus on education and the education between students of color and white students. This slide captures the disheartening change brought forth by COVID when it comes to educating our children. It's just one glimpse into learning at that time. And when you look at the comparative rates, when it comes to math scores, a gap appears in the amount that students learned in 2019 to 2020. According to McKinsey and Company, students in majority Black schools remain 5 months behind the historical levels in both mathematics and reading. And students in majority white schools are now just 2 months behind. So why is this trend important? According to McKinsey and Company, when you consider chronic absenteeism and anticipated high school graduation stats, an additional 1.7 million to 3.3 million of 8th to 12th graders are expected to drop out of school because of the pandemic. So just imagine these emerging trends and how they affect individuals, families, communities, and the workforce that you are trying to attract to your businesses in your organizations. Another side, there was a positive emerging trend that happened during the Great Adaptation, and it was in the area of entrepreneurialism. We saw people rethinking their jobs. They wanted to lean into independent work and reimagine their future as entrepreneurs. The number of new business applications from the US Census was up 38% compared to the year before the pandemic. The majority of those applications stay with small and mostly are limited small businesses and their founders. The CARE Act spurred entrepreneurships, providing some much needed cash, especially for minorities. The last area that we're going to cover during the Great Adaptation deals with culture. We saw employee expectations and organizational cultural shifts during the pandemic due to highly visible instances of racism, injustice, and exclusion, to name just a few. And with that, we saw the emergence of diversity, equity, and inclusion change agendas. We saw increased budgets to address systemic racism. We saw more power and authority for DEI experts to drive change processes. We saw the elevation of DE work and race to higher levels within organizations. So the question becomes, where do we go from here? And so Terry and I wanted to talk a little bit about beyond normal. And as we answer these questions, I want to share one of my favorite quotes with you by author Anne Carson. Anne wrote, and I quote, "Sometimes a journey makes itself necessary," end quote. I cannot imagine a greater time than now for our journey to take diversity, equity, and inclusion to the highest levels possible. And here are a few ideas to place us on this path together. Leadership. In terms of leadership, I want to talk about intersectional leadership. When I first heard the term intersections, it was through McKinsey, which is a consulting firm. They unveiled an e-newsletter, and it was called Intersection. It's devoted to helping others make a vital difference when it comes to diversity, gender equity, gender equality, and inclusion. And they chose the name, and I think this is really important to think about. They chose the name Intersection for two specific reasons. First, because none of us can be defined by any one label or group. Second, the term stems from what we've long known, that innovation and transformation tend to happen at the intersection of industries and cultures and trends. So if we challenge ourselves to become intersectional leaders, we can drive the innovation and the transformation that's necessary to move beyond normal. This type of leadership unleashes a power that transcends anything that we've seen or experienced in the past. It means adopting a mindset that we are never going back to normal, ever. We are never going back to normal, ever. Our influence drives our ability to embrace technology for its unlimited potential to destroy barriers. It's the understanding that different forms of technology can be used in positive ways to mobilize individuals or hundreds of thousands of people towards a common vision. It allows us to build influence together, to have the opportunity to shape a culture of understanding beyond normal. And it means recognizing and appreciating the new ways of thinking and the terms that represent our communities today. Terms like microaggressions, privilege, racial justice, systemic oppression, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, cisgender, gender fluid, non-binary, transitioning. So what Terry and I want you to think about today is that as we continually educate ourselves and others, it's another milestone for all of us to move beyond normal. And what I wanted to share with you and what Terry wanted to share with you too is that we want to talk about a few outcomes that you can take away from today's presentation. We want you to get comfortable with discomfort. Okay, comfortable with discomfort. Identify ways to listen and learn as you formalize a diversity, equity, and inclusion effort. It's important to create and maintain dialogue. We have to acknowledge that there is an issue and we have to collaborate to identify solutions. We have to build diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies together. We need to invite others to the table and establish cohesive strategies and accountabilities. It's not enough to have a strategy if we don't hold ourselves accountable. And lastly, know that diversity, equity, and inclusion is living. It's a living, breathing thing. It represents humanity. It's what we leave behind for future generations. And it deserves the best that each of us have to offer. So at this time, Terry and I are happy to listen to what's been happening on chat. We're willing to take any questions, and we really value your thoughts and ideas. So take it away, Tim, Mike.
Yep, there wasn't any questions in the chat yet, but I invite people to unmute and ask questions if they'd like.
I think what's really interesting too is that Terry and I, we believe that your time is valuable. And so we really want to leave a lot of time aside for you to ask questions or share your insights and everything. And I know it takes a few minutes to think about what do you want to ask. We covered a lot of different information today. So feel free to put it in the chat. I'm sure that there's maybe Tim, you have a question for us too. And if we end early today, that is totally fine.
One question I wanted to ask when it comes like to pay inequity, should companies step up and actually evaluate their pay? You see stories occasionally, not enough, where companies have looked at their pay and then realized, hey, we have an issue, but they should own it.
Yes. I mean, the simple answer is yes. Oftentimes, we're uncomfortable talking about salaries and pay. And so some companies are becoming much more open about salary sharing and allowing people to discuss it. But you also need to take a look at your pay levels and take the gender, take the race, whatever other conditions that might be in your own personal biases applied, and look at building equity in qualifications, education, experience, etc., so that the pay rates can be the same. I think that's where we've seen the most struggle.
I saw that. I was thinking, that's funny. I don't know where it's at. Why would you ask me?
The other thing that I'd like to share is that there's a lot of groups across the state of Iowa that are working to help address that issue. One group is Women Lead Change, and that they're working with a large variety of small companies, corporations, nonprofit organizations, and government to continue to identify the inequity and that to find solutions for that as well. So again, it goes not only to just the two people at this table and those of you who are on this call, this virtual Zoom, but to everyone that's in these different communities and the organizations to come together and align to address this inequity in pay.
I guess something that semi surprised me was the statistic and towards the beginning about a mother will spend 5.5 hours of her day with their child compared to a father that is an hour and a half. To me, that is an eye opener because our children, I'm a single mom and I'm thinking, okay, do I really want to get married? Because I'm still going to be doing all the work. No, I'm kidding. So I mean, that's real though, because the fathers are important. You know, mine just so happens to not be involved, but that's alarming to me, especially when you consider that you kind of also mentioned women working remotely, but that's going to put that number is going to increase dramatically because as a mom who is still working from home, that expectation, the child can't conceptualize mommy time versus work time. And it's that boundary is harder to maintain while working remotely. Although I do think for a lot of moms, yeah, it can work better, but really, is it good for their mental health?
Exactly. And that's a wonderful point because that's what's been the stressor for women trying to adapt to this either hybrid or remote work. They're continuing to do everything. And early in the pandemic, they were even overseeing the education of their children. They might have been taking care of an elder. There weren't a lot of other available services because everything had closed down. That's a significant amount of stress. And being a single mom even exacerbates that because you are the one person that's responsible. So having a little grace because of that, and for those of us with spouses, having that honest discussion about who needs to take care of the child's medical appointments or going to school meetings or all of those things, including the work at home, needs to be something looked at going forward.
And I'd love to see the alignment of diverse viewpoints on this come together when it comes to childcare. You've seen the partnership, you've seen United Way, you've seen Republicans, Democrats, Independents here in Iowa come together to say, we've got to find a solution to childcare. And it came specifically, kind of funny about the paradigm in the past, but also during the pandemic, because childcare, just because you're working at home doesn't mean that you can sit there and take care of your child. And then also helping people further in their career. You know that as a single mom. And so helping people go further in their career, you have to have affordable childcare.
Yeah, no,
Business wants to retain women and employ women. They need to be thinking about those things that are going to make work easier, work life easier. So subsidized childcare, perhaps, providing some benefits for childcare, family leave policies need to be addressed, schedule flexibilities need to be addressed. Even some companies may look at, again, on-site childcare. That was something when I was first in the workforce that was available. And I think a lot of companies began to eliminate that because they either needed the space or there was a liability. Now you won't be able to get those employees back unless you offer options for them with an understanding of the accommodations of the family.
Yeah. We encourage you to share these thoughts just like this because, you know, there's a lot of experts who are on the Zoom call today, and there's a lot of individuals too who feel passionate about these issues. So feel free to share your thoughts and your ideas about what we can do together.
We have a question in the chat, but I just wanted on the childcare part, as companies look for things to invest in, entrepreneurs, women trying to start work, I always find it curious. We invest, and I don't want to make this sound like a negative, but different things that attract professionals like the water trails, which I understand everybody's going to use, but the pro soccer field, etc. Those are all great economic developments. Some I think are more segmented on who may use them, but I don't know why companies don't realize investing in entrepreneurs making childcare and not having childcare deserts and it be affordable will attract a lot more people, professional wise, young families to an area. So do you have any thoughts on how we promote that idea or make that happen?
I have a comment
it's sort of related to that. So my daughter is a professional in the state of Iowa. I also work in the state of Iowa, and she's just had a baby and has returned to work. Now, where she works, they do have daycare that's provided, but it is so expensive that her level of employment, it would go anywhere between, I think she said, a third to a half of her paycheck to go to childcare. And so,
I can tell that's
those,
true.
and yeah,
It's
and so
very true.
those who are like upper management, that's not an issue for them. But for those who are, the entry level sorts of or second level positions, they can't do it. So she has to drive 1 hour to drop her child off than to get to work.
There have been some studies that have measured the cost of infant childcare and equated it to a year of college tuition, which is outrageous. Not to say that childcare and infant care is tremendously critical. Early childhood and attention to children early in life is really important. And my philosophy is, if you are going to attend to the issues that we're facing in society, unless you allow children to be cared for and educated early in ways that allow their parents to continue to be productive, you're never going to break those cycles.
There are some fundamental years that children need to have the attention, they need to have the education, they need not only just the parental support, but the community support, and that we really need to focus on that. You see it within Iowa and you see it throughout the country, but when you're talking about childhood deserts, that's unacceptable. You should be able to thrive and provide childcare in any community in Iowa and any of the 99 counties. The other thing is that when you're spending a half to a third of your paycheck on childcare, it takes away from a quality of life for you and your family. So we have to come together. The business community is doing a great job addressing this issue. And like I mentioned, other nonprofits like United Way. There's so many people that are out there and agencies that are coming together, but it's not enough. We got to keep this focus on childcare.
So Kara in the chat was asking, out of curiosity, what do you know of the pay gap in state government between women and men? How can we advocate to change the disparity?
In public positions, those salaries are publicized. And I think that brings to the forefront the discussion about the pay gap in those arenas, that we as women oftentimes are much more humble about asking for equal pay, or when we're starting jobs, we're not good at negotiating. So one of the things that we're doing at Chrysalis is teaching girls and women that you have value equal to, if not more so, than another employee, and advocate for yourself. So I think the very fact that we know those disparities exist and we're not discussing them or addressing them still provides that allowing those pay disparities to continue. So I think the more we can publicize the gaps, the disparities, and try to press those that are decision makers in those arenas, we can get them to come to grips with equalizing the pay field.
And when I was in state government, I was very young. I was in my early 20s, and it was during the farm crisis. And at that point in time, there was a lot of discussion about getting women into positions of leadership within state government and also county boards and governors, boards, and commissions. And we started to see some movement at that point in time. I came back to state government nearly, I'm going to call it 28 to 30 years later.
Yeah, well, I'm meeting.
And there was some movement, and you did see more women in positions of power, especially when you came to the legislature, when it came to agency department heads, and when it came to the executive branch, and when it came to the judicial. But we can't afford to say that's enough. We have to keep moving forward and eliminate that gap. And it does start with local, state, and federal government to be a model for others.
Another good comment in the chat, whoops, sorry about that. It moved on me, I apologize. Rural Iowa areas are really hard on families due to not having options for bigger that bigger cities have. There's up to a 2-year wait list for childcare, and not all employers are willing to have flexible schedules for men or women. So always an issue. And I've always wondered why everybody who has a child, doesn't matter male or female, school starts at a certain time. And I've never understood the flexibility to allow to get a child at least on the bus, and have that flexibility to get your day done so you can, with both parents working, stagger schedules. So
Decisions are being made about school schedules and before and after school programs, oftentimes without input from women and working families. And that's one challenge that I think we continue to face is when a school board decides to let school out early, for example, on an afternoon every week, no one has talked to parents about how are you going to come and pick them up? What are you going to do with childcare during that time, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to get parents, especially working women, involved in those decisions. Now with the childcare deserts, that's an issue that I think needs to be brought to the attention of legislators and policymakers, because they are not thinking in terms of the economy. They're thinking in terms of what an expense is going to be. When you stop to consider that it's an economic development issue and you begin to frame it that way, keeping women employed, training people to provide childcare, their certification and professional. And the other piece that we've not discussed is what we've known as the cliff effect, which is women who are earning hourly wage and may get a childcare subsidy, but let's say she gets a 25-cent an hour increase. Well, that kicks her off the childcare subsidy. So she loses much more money than she gains and often turns down that pay raise because she can't afford to lose that benefit. So we need to be looking at how we can make childcare subsidies available. I think employers need to step into the role of looking at how they can help support working families in whatever way works. And in rural areas, finding those places that can provide a home for safe and affordable childcare. Oftentimes it's a church or a nonprofit center, et cetera. But then being able to support that in a way that's going to make it productive.
Yeah, and I would just add too, because my perspective comes from state government and also being a small business owner, co-owner, I should say, if my husband's on the Zoom call. He established the company, but we work together in a Huggins Consulting Group. So Jeff, I know where my place is in the hierarchy, but watch out. 80% of businesses in Iowa are small businesses. And what you're seeing is that these business owners are coming together to say, let's figure out a solution for childcare. The other thing that you see that's within Iowa that I think is really, really impressive and other states look for is how do business groups like the Greater Des Moines Partnership, like the Iowa Association of Business and Industry, like the Iowa Business Council, how do these organizations, not to mention all the development firms and Chamber of Commerce across the state, how do they come together in a united front to talk about the cliff effect and about childcare? And I think that there is progress taking place. Is it enough? We have to continue that discussion.
Another comment, when you work with a company that lacks racial diversity, it can be difficult to discuss some of the microaggressions you face in your position with those who have not experienced racial inequity. It feels like a barrier to being my authentic self at times. So
microaggressions, for people who haven't experienced microaggressions, it's really how a person feels, and especially it could be in the workplace, it could be socially and other things like that. And it's how people treat you. There's stories, and I can only share the one that I experienced personally as a woman. in financial services, I remember earlier in my career being the only person in the room and having people call me sweetie and honey and not taking my opinions seriously. Well, 20 years later, when I went back in the same industry, it's come night and day. I can't speak to being Black. I can't speak to being Latino. But microaggressions, when you talk about a sensitive issue in the workplace, the best way to address that is to be able to talk about it freely and talk about resolution, and also do some role playing. Allow people the opportunity to understand how it feels to have that happen to them.
If anybody has any other questions, please put them in there. Adding to the,
I just
Go
want to add to that point about workplace or about any place as far as racial and ethnic diversity. What I like to encourage people to do is be curious.
Yeah.
If you obviously, I think there was a term years ago called cultural humility, which was about understanding that that person is a woman, is perhaps a Black woman or a brown woman or an Indigenous woman, whatever the case might be, but she has a different worldview than you have. So be curious about what that is. Be empathetic, want to learn, like she might want to learn a little bit more about your worldview. But when we approach things in life with the expectation that everybody has the same experience, everyone comes from the same background and the same lens, we're never going to break through that diversity opportunity to learn about other cultures and adapt and engage and feel really comfortable with other cultures. I love the idea that this is such a diverse, the world is becoming much more diverse. And we learn from those that we work with, we learn from friends, and be curious about others, comment on someone's perhaps different clothing or their practices, and have an understanding and want to understand why and how they feel the way that they do.
And it's really important to know that on this inclusion committee, Cultural, if you haven't been exposed to this group in Central Iowa, Cultural is a wonderful opportunity to go and experience different cultures and to be exposed and be curious about that.
Yeah, they do a lot with the arts. They do a lot in the schools.
Yeah.
My husband does a lot of workshops for Cultural. He's Mexican. And I have, in meeting him, learned a lot more about the types of experiences that shape his worldview. And it's brought to light a lot of things that I maybe had made assumptions about growing up in primarily white Des Moines, Iowa, back in the 60s and 70s.
Yep, I had to confess, I work with Cultural, and I don't know if you're talking about RJ Hernandez.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I've done some events with him, and actually had him come out to our work and perform. But I think it goes a lot to what you were saying. You say, there's more. I like that there's more diversity now, but it's worth mentioning it was already there. It just wasn't brought in, and it wasn't as accessible. So trying to think the best way to put this. I've always said, like when I do cultural things, since you brought that up, you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And I think the political correctness is the right thing, but it's swung a little bit so far you're afraid to ask, and it's put a bit of a barrier there too. You mix in there with fatigue, like how long have we fought for different rights? How long have these issues been going on? And yes, they're getting more attention now, but people are kind of tired of talking about it, even though everybody is more willing to hear about it now. So how do we break past that as well and start these conversations with the folks who can influence it? How does somebody on this call go back to work and say, boss, this is a problem?
I think bringing in opportunities to learn about other cultures is really helpful so that people can feel at least articulate in understanding what those cultures are about. Another concept that I've used when I've talked to different groups about perhaps poverty or race or whatever that situation might be, and why everyone should be accepted equally. A statement that I make is, the next time that I'm born, I'm going to fill out the application to be Indigenous with a single mom and a father who's in jail, and the whole 9 yards. And people say, that's impossible for you to do. Well, it's not as though any of us has a choice for where and how we're born. It's what we make of it. And so I think children today are much more open-minded because they're probably exposed to so much more cultural diversity than we were growing up. But we can learn a lot from children as well.
And I would just add, I was jotting down some notes and listening to Terry and thinking about how do you introduce culture into an organization, a small business, is that you have to be that voice within the organization. You have to be able to say, no, we can't change our culture within our business or organization without understanding the cultures that exist in our community. Because you need to think about attracting a different type of workforce. Because when we say, you can't go back, when people say, what's next, we're saying, hey, next is now, so let's keep moving forward. So have those conversations, be the person in the room. And if you are an introverted person, then find an opportunity to write something to your leaders or be the person, that voice to say, we need to understand cultures better and we need to change our culture.
Perry and Catherine, Joe Gonzalez here. Just a quick question.
Yeah.
What are the challenges for women, especially immigrant women coming from countries where it's male dominated, trying to assimilate into into work here to kind of know that, they have the same rights and, they could be the ones that would be taken advantage of as far as obviously pay equity for sure, because that's always a problem anyway. But knowing how do you address that? How can companies address that to make sure that all the information is gotten to them so that they understand that the culture they came from is now different from wherever they're at and the rights that they have here, especially in the workplace?
That is a very complex issue, and I can give you a couple suggestions on that. But one of the things when you're, and Terry probably has a lot to say on this too, but when you're working with women who come from repressive cultures, it's important to work within groups of that community, because they're going to be able, if you listen carefully, they're going to be able to tell you about the experiences of those women and how to approach the women. So they are familiar with their rights. They are familiar with what our country is about and being able to speak their voice and not be punished and so forth. So work within the community. The second thing is that you have to model the behavior. You have to see it to be it. And that means I happen to teach in a college setting. And I have students that are from countries where the female voice is not heard. And they come to class and they sit very in a demure manner. They don't actively participate and use their voice during class. What I found is that we have to be able to draw women out from those countries to be able to reassure them that they're in a safe space and that their voice is valued. And sometimes that means not in front of a group, but it means talking to them one-on-one so that they understand and feel safe. They have to be psychologically safe in order to understand all the other implications of life.
Very true. The other thing about various populations, immigrant and refugee populations particularly, is working through trusted champions. So if you find a person, culture that you can work with that can become a leader of the group or help impart some information, Another way that, as an example, years ago, there was an effort to distribute information on reproductive care out into the state. And what they did was they found those places, whether it was a church group or a salon, or maybe a daycare center or somewhere else, where they educated the staff that they would interface with so that the information was coming to them from a trusted person. Oftentimes church in some communities as well is the same. So as you look at trying to impart information, build trust with someone who is a champion or a leader, and in the workforce, look at training, promoting, and mentoring champions of women and girls or various cultures.
And look within families, because when you look at different ethnic groups, the importance of family, and there's different generations. And so even if someone has come to the United States, depending upon the generation, the younger generation may understand all these different things, and their parents are relying on them and trust them to share the right information. So we have to look into our schools as well.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yep.
One of the other points I wanted to bring up, we talk about bias, and that can cover a lot of things, but unconscious bias wise, a good example I try to use, and this affects, we're talking about women in leadership roles and stuff. There's been a lot of studies. I think they said 30% of all CEOs are over 6 foot tall, but the vast majority, because they're mostly men, or 5'9" is the average. But they also tie the study back to this is evolution, and someone being bigger seems like they should be in charge, or at least they should possess leadership because of that. But it's an unconscious bias nobody even realizes they have. So how do they broach the subject, as you go through with leadership, that people are willing to list the unconscious bias without thinking you're immediately going to the racist card, which seems to be the big debate these days.
Oftentimes, a lot depends if you want to be a model of acceptance and welcoming. People may look to you as to how you behave, whether it's with other people, with other cultures, whatever the case might be. So I do often tell people, kids are watching you, others are watching you. So depending on your reaction, you may help educate and inform as you are behaving with courtesy and curiosity with someone else. But your one point, Tim, about height, I look at Madeleine Albright, who unfortunately died this week, but was 4'9", and what a powerhouse she was, and never let that, her size ever precede any of her ability to be a leader. So helping those that may have some other issue that they struggle with, whether it's height or a disability, etc., helping them understand that that can be an asset, but it certainly should not be a barrier or a detriment.
Yeah. Unconscious bias, and when you talk about bringing it into the workplace or talking to your boss or bringing it to the attention of leaders who maybe have that bias, is that you need to think about ways that are non-threatening, bring people in that can talk about it, people that they respect, work with the experts, have them come in and do some training, but don't let go of that, because unconscious bias exists around us every day. And we have a responsibility too, that if we are exposed to it, to be that voice, to raise our hand and say, hey, you may not have meant this, but I want to pull you aside and want to talk to you about this.
Recognition is the first step.
It is.
Absolutely. Okay, I don't see anything else in the chat. Do you have any final comments that you?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
You had mentioned during your conversation around trying to create more of a space where diversity, equity, and inclusion can be more accountable. For the region, for the state. I know we're part of a group, we're working on trying to come up with some of these regional concepts. How would you all suggest or recommend in our current climate would be the best way to try to get more regional buy-in to really everyone coming around these regional goals or metrics even per se, but just for the greater good of what we all know we need to be based off of your conversation today.
Okay. One of the things that you see happening in Iowa already is that these discussions come and they bubble through. I'm thinking of United Way, and I'm thinking about what United Way is doing in the Quad Cities. I'm thinking about what United Way is doing here, is that there's no one fix. And it's not just about resolution, it's about being able to bring the right people to the table to be able to make a difference. And accountability is not only metrics. And I have to stress that because sometimes when we come together to fix an issue, it's always about, well, let's define the issue and let's put metrics and let's measure. But for this particular issue, we have to have accountabilities that we hold ourselves to as individuals, and that organizations can formalize, and that we're a very small state, we're 99 counties, that we can do that regionalization to be able to go through and customize it, because you have urban versus rural, you have white versus different diverse communities. And we have to take that step back and we have to sit there and talk about accountabilities in a different way in order for them to be effective. And I think that in the past, accountabilities were put into a column of metrics.
Another thing I think we've seen is companies locally and probably throughout the state are bringing in diversity officers who pay particular attention to educating the workforce and bringing out some of these learning opportunities for employees to begin to understand, you know, what are some of these issues that I may need to learn about or deal with, or what are the biases that I may be facing, or maybe I should be looking at the communication that we have, and trying to help people understand perhaps they don't know what they don't know, and inviting people to learning opportunities can help them understand the value of diversity and what that brings to the table.
Thank you so much. We have about 5 minutes left. So one of the things we like to do is, when I was going to ask about your final thoughts there as well, is we like to give everybody what we call a call to action. So I didn't know if you had one particular thing you thought everybody could contribute to or should do to help with this issue.
You want to go first, and then?
Yeah, I'll start.
Okay.
One of the points that I like to make is it's probably harkens back to that cultural humility idea, but I don't know everything. And so if people can have an appreciation for curiosity and want to understand instead of fight or argue or oppose, and welcome new opportunities to learn, I think that may be very helpful in everything that you do and all the interactions that you have. A lot of times we don't see those biases that maybe even exist in our promotional brochures or our, you know, whatever the case might be, our communications, our emails, our letters, all the types of things that continue to perpetuate those biases. When you begin to, suddenly the light bulb goes on and you see that those things could be taken in a different way, you'll begin to appreciate bringing that equity into everything that you're doing.
Yeah, it's so funny. I love working with Terry because we think in a lot of similar ways. And when she was talking about curiosity and learning, the one takeaway, and I do this with students that I work with, when I teach a class at the end of the session, I stand by the door and I say, okay, you learned a lot today, you know, it's been an hour, hour and a half and everything. Tell me the one thing. Tell me the one thing that you learned today that you're willing to share with others. And so that is what I would challenge today from this call, is when Terry's talking about curiosity and learning and listening, I would challenge everyone, this is free. You can do this. It doesn't require anything, but I would challenge everyone to think about what was the one thing that you heard today that you know you can make a difference, and you share that with another person. And then ask them to share it with another person, because it starts here. It starts with people being around the same table and having this discussion. So that's what I would say.
No more to say, that's it.
No more.
All right, well, thank you very much. If you want to reach out to our speakers or be put in contact, please, feel free to reach out to the partnership. I'll have you know that we have a program the fourth Thursday of every month. We have multicultural receptions. I invite everybody to get on the Greater Des Moines Partnerships event page and register. There's plenty of free events. The next one will be in April that we're talking about reentry events. Later in March is a multicultural reception that's being hosted by DMAC. So plenty of opportunities to get involved and learn more on our different diversity, equity, inclusion, ways to help the workforce. So, and I really want to thank both of our speakers again. It's greatly appreciated.